Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron thinks there would be a legal case to strike Islamic State in Syria. He says the military assets Britain has flying over Syria could be used in airstrikes against IS if there is a decision made to take military action. Mr Cameron, of course, is dealing with the ongoing fallout of the terror attack in Tunisia last week that killed 30 British tourists. Ross Burnett is the director of the Against Violent Extremism Network, and he joins us now. Ross, of course, military action has been a big part of the response to IS, but countering it is such a complex issue, and the work you're doing is really trying to understand a lot better how they operate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, military action is obviously one part of the solution, but ultimately, until we can dry up the pools of recruits that are replenishing the ranks of groups like ISIS and others, we're never really going to be able to beat this in a long-term sense. So we try and work with former extremists and survivors of extremism to tackle them where they're strongest, which is their messaging.
Let's talk about that, because what you have discovered is that the way they use social media is very systematic and manipulative.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ISIS could really give a masterclass in social media to most of the terrorist groups, and in fact many brands. They've been highly active in putting out their propaganda and also in directly recruiting people. But the good news is that these platforms that they're operating on are owned by Western companies. The marketing experts and those people most skilled at creating films, such as Hollywood and others, are also sitting in our camp. So the challenge for us isn't whether or not those people that are against ISIS know how to use these things. The real challenge is how do we mobilize those people around the right messengers to start taking the fight back to ISIS online. And we've actually already started to see some examples of that being reasonably successful.
Give us some of those examples.
So there's a number of initiatives which have come about, such as taking the voices of survivors of ISIS violence and projecting those into the kinds of spaces that ISIS are operating in. We don't need to have a scattergun approach to targeting those people that are at risk of radicalization. With modern marketing techniques, we can actually target people that are following pro-ISIS Twitter accounts. We can target people that are watching pro-ISIS videos on YouTube, and we can take the voices of those people that have suffered the brutality of ISIS and inject those into those spaces and start a more positive conversation. So we actually have the tools at our disposal to start undermining this ISIS narrative, not just with survivors, but also with former ISIS members generally and former extremists who will have credibility with those young people considering joining this group in the first place. And
Ross, is your approach as one-on-one as ISIS is on social networks?
Yeah, so we have a mixed approach on this. So the organisation I work with, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, works upstream, doing some education work called Extreme Dialogue. We'd encourage anyone to take a look at that. We do some propaganda work, which is counter-propaganda, capacity-building work, which is based on videos. And we've also started seeing examples of this one-to-one work being piloted as well. So having former extremists directly reach out to young people that are expressing support for ISIS and offering to engage them in a conversation, because that's what ISIS do, and only when we start to properly mirror their processes can we hope to start to bring some of these young people back.
And I was interested to read about some work that you're doing with a woman who was involved, and this is such a surprise just how vulnerable huge numbers of women are in being recruited by IS.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London has a Women in Extremism programme which has started looking at why it is that women are drawn towards extremist groups like ISIS, because there's obviously been a huge surge in that lately. And what we found is the things that drive women to join these organisations are actually very similar to those that drive men. You're talking about a sense of outrage at what's going on in Syria, an adherence to the ideology, and also just a general search for belonging. What makes ISIS different to previous groups is, while there wouldn't necessarily have been a role for women joining Al-Qaeda previously, is that because ISIS controls a large piece of territory and is trying to establish a state, it needs women. So women have a role there in a way they never really had before. And
they think it's a role alongside sort of heroes, but in fact they're going into this kind of late 50s slavedom.
Yeah, so we discussed this in our different pieces of research, one called Becoming Milan and one called Till Martyrdom Do Us Part, that many of the women, especially Western women who go there, do have some sort of aspiration to engage in some sort of frontline role. However, it's explained to them pretty clearly before they go that regardless of those aspirations, they will be consigned to this domestic, as you say, almost 1950s housewife role. And we've already seen some examples of Western women that have travelled to ISIS-held territory becoming frustrated with that as well, because it's not what you envisage, either A, in terms of a utopia, or B, in terms of your own particular role within that. And that's the kind of message we need to be getting out more to our vulnerable young women.
Indeed. Ross, such fascinating work, and so important that you are doing it. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.